So hello, everyone. My name is Christoph Lutz. I'm an associate professor at BI Norwegian Business School in Oslo, Norway. And today I'm going to talk about privacy issues in robotics. And I'm going to give you a multi-method overview based on research I've done in the last couple of years. So I also coordinated the talk a little bit with Bill Smart because he's also going to talk about privacy later on. So we made sure that there shouldn't be too much overlap between the presentations. The agenda for my presentation will be the following. I will start with an overview from a study based on a scoping review and expert interviews. So this is kind of a field survey where we showed the different publications and the trends when it comes to robotics and privacy. In the second part, I'm going to go into some workshops we ran at three different robotics companies. Sorry. 3 different robotics conferences. And in the last part, I'm going to show you a survey which is based on the perceptions of privacy issues regarding robotics. So I'm going to go from the more general to the more specific throughout the talk. And I want to start with the first study or the first paper. As I mentioned, this is based on a systematic scoping review of research in robotics and privacy. It has been published last year in Mobile Media and Communication. But what we did in this paper is to try to systematically analyze what has been published in terms of social robots and privacy. So this search was conducted in July 2017 in Web of Science. So this is probably since then, I guess a lot of new research has been published. So this is a bit of a thing to consider and keep in mind. We used the search strings privacy and robots or robotics. We also used different wildcard identifiers that are related to these terms to cover a relatively broad scope, but we wanted to focus mostly on social robots within this paper. So we got 77 initial results, not too many, still manageable amount of publications, but we had to weed out quite a few of them. First of all, because they weren't really about privacy as the core topic, but privacy was just mentioned in the abstract as kind of a side topic. We also removed those that were not about social robots, but about other types of robots. So in the end, we had 21 publications, and we then added 12 based on snowballing and the further theory-based literature review. So in the end, we were left with 33 texts that we then used for the systematic literature review. We used the Cochrane review methodology. This is based on medical sciences, like an established procedure on how to conduct systematic literature reviews. This was also complemented by expert interviews. We wanted to dig a bit deeper and go into a bit more personal accounts of the topics that the literature discussed. So we conducted 6 expert interviews in June and August 2017. So roughly at the same time as we conducted the literature review. For that, we used a semi-structured interview guideline and protocol with 23 questions. These questions are also in the paper, in the appendix. And the interviews lasted for about half an hour on average. And here in the table, you see the overview of the different participants. We tried to sample both academics and people outside of academia, but there was a bit majority of academics across different career stages. So there was a PhD student, 1 lecturer, an associate professor, and a professor, and then 1 industry practitioner working in a robotics company, and 1 legal advisor working for a data protection agency in Germany. So these were the people that participated in the expert interviews. And in terms of results, first of all, we saw that there's an increase in interest in privacy and robotics over the years, even though these numbers are small, but we see a general increase after about 2015. So the last 5-6 years have seen a surge in publications. And I'm pretty confident that if we did the search again today, we would probably see the linear or exponential growth here. when we analyze the publications based on the discipline of the authors that authored these papers, we saw that almost or a bit more than a fourth of the papers were based over law in the area of law. Computer science was the second most prominent discipline. We also had coded papers that were co-authored by multiple disciplines. We coded them for all the disciplines involved. So that's why you have more than the 33 or the 100%. But overall, we see that it's a very interdisciplinary research field across the social sciences, engineering, and more technical sciences. When we looked at the robot type that these publications were about, we found that health was the predominant robot type. I mean, social robots were also mentioned. And then some of the papers didn't go into much detail what type of robots it actually was. So these are some of the findings from the literature review. The expert interviews then kind of confirmed or supported many of the themes we found in the literature review, but they also added a bit of extra nuance, I would say. We found, first of all, that quite a few of the experts talked about the evolving notions of privacy with social robots, that privacy is changing. This quote kind of exemplifies this. Over the years, the definition of privacy has kind of evolved. It began with privacy, at least informational privacy, having something to do with control over personal information. That definition is no longer adequate, if it ever was. And so now I think of privacy as being largely about the role of autonomy in a world that is so data promiscuous. And the expert also mentioned the multifaceted privacy threats, which are more complex than with other types of technologies. So one expert described a study, not a study, but a robot made by MIT, and then went on to describe the social bonding, where people would be happy to tell it all of their worries because there wasn't a real social agent. It wasn't a friend or a colleague, it was a robot. And so they were able to speak to it and tell them all of their worries, even more so than they would with real people. So in the end, we summarized the different insights from the systematic literature review and from the expert interviews, and we grouped them into 4 different dimensions. And these dimensions are based on an existing privacy framework or typology that differentiates informational, psychological, social, and physical privacy. And we found that the informational privacy was the predominant theme in the literature. So the other 3 types of privacy, which are more about boundary management in the case of social privacy, or more about spatial and physical things, these were much less discussed in the studies we actually assessed. So there seems to be a predominance of informational privacy when it comes to robotics, and including topics such as the sensitivity of data that robots process and can collect. Security risk was quite a prominent theme. Also cloud robotics and the connectivity to the cloud, which which might potentially expose the data. And some texts and interviewees talked about opacity. But for us, actually, the social privacy was a very interesting aspect, which is more prominent in robots than it is with other technologies that are less interactive. Here, we found that social bonding was a key theme. The bonding between a robot and the user might lead to trust, which can then lead to the revelation of sensitive data. So we did find that a lot of these dimensions kind of were connected to each other. So this was the first paper I wanted to discuss. Second one, as I mentioned, is based on workshops. We ran at 4 different conferences. And this is published in the International Journal of Social Robotics. Came out relatively recently. But we together with 2 colleagues, Eduard Foch-Villaronga and Aurelia Tamot-Larieux, we organized 3 workshops, actually 4 workshops at 3 conferences in 2016 and 2017. So the 3 conferences were first the New Friends Conference, which was where we ran the workshop twice in 2016 and also in 2017, but in a slightly different format. We then ran the workshop at the Japanese Society for Artificial Intelligence. The conference took place in 2016 in Yokohama. And finally, we also ran the workshop at the European Robotics Forum, which was in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 2017. Throughout these workshops, we focused on ELS, ethical, legal, and social aspects of social robots in therapy and education. So the topic was a bit more broad than privacy, but privacy was one of the three key topics when we structured these workshops. So ethics, dignity, privacy, and liability were the key topics. And in all of these workshops, we used case studies and open discussion formats. We also divided the workshops into a more challenge-based part, where we try to identify key issues and challenges. And we then also try to identify solutions, potential solutions to these challenges. So in terms of privacy, I would say the overarching theme throughout the workshops was concern about surveillance and access, and finally security vulnerabilities. The experts then went on to discuss specific aspects. One common problem was the lack of a common understanding. Reminded me a bit earlier when we talked about AI and the AI guidelines, where we also have different definitions and understandings, and this was reflected when it comes to privacy, which is in the literature a very complex and contested term with a lot of different meanings. The issue with robotics, or robots in particular, the lack of consent and control, that it's hard or harder to control what's going on due to the autonomy of the technology. And especially in group settings, consent can be quite complicated. Some of the solutions that were mentioned, some were more legal, some were more technological, but throughout data minimization was mentioned and purpose limitation. This is now also enshrined in the GDPR. We ran these workshops before the GDPR went into force, but a lot of the guidelines reflect things that are now actually in the GDPR. Dynamic consent, like a robot asking more than once at the beginning for consent, and is kind of more interactive in asking for consent. The transparency and right to explanation was also mentioned as an aspect of privacy, that the robots should be able in some ways to communicate the data collection to the user in an understandable fashion. And finally, throughout the different talks and workshops, we also noticed a theme of user empowerment, that it should be made easy for users to access their data and also to erase the data if possible. So now for the remaining couple of minutes, I want to talk about the last paper, which is more, which is quantitative. So we did a survey, was published just a few weeks ago in the Human Machine Communication Journal, which is a really new journal at the intersection of communication and technology. And for this research, we looked into the use intention for robots and how privacy concerns affect the use intention. So the paper is kind of framed within the privacy paradox literature, which is the literature that analyzes the intersection of privacy attitudes and concerns on the one hand, and privacy behavior on the other hand. And has been found that people in surveys, they often say they are very worried about privacy. We see levels of privacy concerns that are very high, but the actions that people then have and follow through are often not in that spirit. So a lot of people disclose sensitive information on the internet. A lot of people are not very open towards privacy protection. They are not using alternative, more privacy-friendly services, even being concerned about privacy. So this was the theoretical background of the paper. And we wanted to test the privacy paradox in the context of robots and social robots. So we conducted a survey based on Amazon Mechanical Turk respondents in the United States. We had a rough gender split, almost 50-50. The survey was done in 2016. And here we differentiated 3 different concern types. Similar to before, we looked at physical privacy concerns, institutional privacy concerns, and informational privacy concerns. Institutional concerns are more about the manufacturer of a robot, and social informational concerns are more about other users doing shady things with the robot. And then the data we collected was analyzed with structural equation modeling. Just quickly, I will talk about the descriptive statistics and the privacy concerns. I think this is probably the most interesting takeaway from this study. As I mentioned, we differentiated these 3 different types. The first type is physical privacy concerns. So how concerned are the people, the respondents, about the robot infringing on their privacy? And here we had 3 different questions or items, all of them on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, ranging from no concern to very high concern. You can see everything below 3 means that people generally disagree. Everything above 3 means that people generally agree with the statement. So values like here 1.9 and 2.14 mean that there's disagreement or low concern with the statement. So people are not very concerned about personal questions. They are also not very concerned about the robot or robot snooping through personal belongings. So this was the privacy concern type that was the least pronounced. The picture looked very different when we looked at institutional privacy on the manufacturer side. So here we actually saw much higher concern, average values of 3.7, meaning that people are quite concerned about insufficient data protection, about the manufacturer selling the data or some of the data that is collected, or also sharing data with the government. So this was the most pronounced type of privacy concern. And finally, the social concerns that we included were about other users infringing on their privacy by doing things such as hacking the robot, stalking you through the robot, or identity theft. It has to be said that the respondents were for most part not familiar with robots. So these are non-experts, people that don't have a history of owning a robot or operating a robot. But we saw that the social informational concerns were in between the other 2 concern types. So here people had moderate to high concerns, I would say. The structural equation model you see here, the main takeaway here is that privacy concerns did not have a significant effect on robot use intention, which is in line with the privacy paradox literature. So it means that people do worry about privacy or some types of privacy, but this doesn't really affect their use or intention of social robots. But what instead has a quite strong pronounced effects are perceived benefits. So how useful the robot would be for their everyday lives. And this kind of overrides the privacy concerns. And the same is true for trust. We didn't find a significant effect of trust on robot use intention. So the last study kind of supported the notion of the privacy paradox. This is all I had to say. I'm very happy to answer your questions and looking forward to the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, that's also very nice. I noticed that that's the privacy question is also maybe the question that's been most active in the Reddit papers for the conference. There's a few papers on robots and privacy, but not so much about the other themes that we have so far.